Happy Monday! Monday is the day where I, for good or bad, show you some behind the scenes of writing, creating, building music. These are usually little teeny things. They're not finished, just like the one today. They just try to give you a little insight into where this music comes from. So, let's get started. Make it up on a Monday. Today's groove was a total accident. Unfortunately, that means I didn't record big parts of building it. I was sitting around midnight, 1 in the morning, just kind of messing around, and the next thing I know, I had the groove that I wanted to use for this video, but it was already done. The good news is that this is an 8-bar groove that is built by adding layer after layer after layer on top of the previous layers. And so I can recreate how it got built. So it started with a drum beat. I kind of got the idea for this real traditional, I don't know what, chinka, 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 straight eighth notes, about 120, 128 beats per minute. And there's this beat where you hit the snare on beat 2, but then you move to a tom-tom on beat 4, usually with an eighth note. And that beat ended up sounding a little something like this. But I wanted to add a little bit of a tambourine part, just a little tambourine sample on eighth notes. Let's add that in next. It's common for a drummer to use the bell of a ride cymbal. And you can take your stick and kind of hit it sideways, and you put that on every eighth note offbeat. So let's throw that in on top of our tambourine and our set. This is clearly a bit of a Latin flavored beat. It's a pattern called a clave. I shifted that positioning just slightly, eighth note wise, to make it interplay with the existing drum parts. I'll show you where it is. So we've got the beginnings of a pretty traditional 60s Latin rock beat. We want to add a little piano, of course. Now I was thinking in the key of E. I was thinking there's a common thing to use tenths. I wanted a nice big strong hit on the downbeat. And then to play with that eighth note pattern. Just sort of moves along like you're walking down the beach. But you know me, I love these little ghosted patterns that add something. And I particularly like them when the ghosted notes go back and forth between your left hand and your right hand. And what I came up with was this pattern that goes, hit the downbeat, play a B in your left hand, a D in your right hand, the E in your left hand, before we hit that. And I love those little ghosted notes. They just add a little bit of sparkle. So if we put the piano with the drum beat that we had before, it sounds a little something like this. Listen to the way the clave, which is normally rolling in this sort of 3 pattern, but it drops to 2 quarter notes right in a row, right in that gap. I love it when you're listening to one part, say the piano part, and something else just kind of peeks out and says, hey, look at me. That little clave right in the gap there. So this is the part where things either got really cool or totally went off the rails, depending on your perspective. I wasn't sure where to go next, and I just turned everything off and added a big traditional EDM hard 4 on the floor kick drum. And the next obvious thing was to bring in some bass, just eighth notes. Now let's take a tiny little detour into some electronic music production techniques. In a beat like this, everything revolves around the kick drum. And there's a technique that's widely used, using a compressor and the bass part to bring the kick drum more to the forefront. I'm just going to simplify this, but a compressor is like a super responsive robot with his hand on the volume knob. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but in general, imagine that when a trigger comes in that says this is louder than some certain threshold, the robot will turn the volume down. by a certain amount, and then at a very specific speed, turn the volume knob back up. Usually this happens when you're trying to take a recorded part that's got a lot of dynamic range, a lot of really loud parts and then some quiet parts. You want to control that, tame that a little bit. And so you put a compressor on there to sort of say, okay, take the high parts, turn them down a little bit, and then let's take the overall volume of everything and sort of bring it up. That way we compress the dynamic range into a smaller difference between the highs and lows. Now there's a technique that's widely used in electronic music called sidechain compression, where instead of using the actual sound of the track to drive its own compression, you'd use the signal from some other place to adjust the volume knob. And in this case, we're going to take the bass and we're going to control its volume knob by the kick drum. In other words, when the kick drum hits, let's turn the volume knob down on the bass and then turn it back up. And we want to time it so that it turns up in between the kick drum beats. Okay, so to demonstrate this, first of all, I'm going to play the kick drum and the bass together, but I'm going to disable all of the compression. It's fine, but if we bring in that sidechain compression, you'll notice that the bass begins to pump a little bit. The kick drum hits, and then everything else kind of comes back. It's like it's waking up, and it happens on every beat. Let's add a clap sound on 2 and 4. We are going to the club. Let's add a little hi-hat. So now what the heck? We've got this totally electronic thing. We've got this like 60s Latin thing. We've got this piano part. But the piano part isn't enough by itself, right? Okay, so let's turn all of that off and go back to our piano part a little bit. As I've mentioned, I love it when you've got one part that has gaps in it that another part can play with. It makes it start to sound like a musical conversation. So this piano part has big gaps in it. Right there. Here's one. Here's another one. So maybe we can add in a bass part that is more of this sort of electronic feel, but plays in the spaces of the piano part. We put those two things together. So we're starting to have a little bit more music happening. Now I kind of wanted a melody over the top of all this. It's not just a groove, but when you've got so much going on, we've got the Latin thing, we've got this house beat that's happening, we've got these two piano and bass parts that are kind of having a conversation, we've got that sub bass down there. There's not a lot of room left. So the melody has to be something that just kind of sits above all of this. So I added this long single note that's got a little bit of a vibrato effect on it, and then it plays a couple just kind of snarky in-your-face notes. Very simple, but when you combine it with the bass and the piano, so, before we listen to the entire stinking groove, just a reminder, I would love it if you'd subscribe if you haven't already. Some of these were bound to be winners, some of them are bound to be losers. What'd you think of this one? Let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for feedback and questions and places I can go in the future. So speak up, let's have a conversation. And with that, I hope to see you next time.